Elias Jones stood in the rain, holding a cardboard box that contained everything he had earned in 8 years at Nexus Industries. He was 36 years old, a black American single father, and as of 4:17 that afternoon, unemployed. The termination letter cited corporate restructuring, but the security guard who escorted him out couldn't meet his eyes. By the time Elias pulled into his apartment complex, a notice was already taped to his door. Eviction, 30 days. His 7-year-old daughter, Amara, a girl with tight dark brown coils framing her face, pressed her face against the window of their car, watching him read the paper twice. 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. "Daddy," she whispered when he climbed back in, rain dripping from his natural, short-cropped hair. "What do we do now?" He had no answer. A black SUV glided past them on the wet pavement, and through its tinted window a woman with auburn hair glanced out. Vivian Hart, the new CEO. Her eyes lingered on the black father and daughter for just a moment longer than they should have, and something in her expression shifted, though she said nothing, and the SUV carried her away into the gray afternoon. The Human Resources office smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. Elias had arrived 15 minutes before opening, hoping to speak with someone, anyone, who might help him understand what had happened. He had worked at Nexus since he was 28, starting in the mailroom, working his way up to facilities coordinator. His performance reviews had been consistently positive. His attendance record was nearly flawless, save for the 3 days he took when Amara had pneumonia 2 winters ago. None of it mattered now. The woman behind the desk barely looked up when he approached. Her nameplate read, Deborah Stanton, Human Resources Assistant Director. Elias explained his situation calmly, methodically. He asked if there might be a different position available, something in another department, perhaps a lower pay grade. He wasn't proud. He just needed to keep working to keep his daughter fed and housed. Deborah shuffled some papers without reading them. Her voice was flat when she finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jones. There's nothing available for someone in your situation." Elias, a black man in a space where he suddenly felt deeply unwelcome, asked what that meant. His situation. Deborah's smile didn't reach her eyes. This company is moving in a new direction. Some people just aren't the right fit anymore. I'm sure you understand. He didn't understand. He stood there for a long moment, waiting for something more, some explanation that made sense. But Deborah had already turned back to her computer, her fingers clicking across the keyboard as if he had already left, as if he had never been there at all. That night, Elias drove to the edge of town, where there was a quiet parking lot behind a shuttered grocery store. It was safer than sleeping on the street and dark enough that no one would notice a car parked there overnight. Amara had been quiet since they left the apartment, her small backpack clutched in her lap. It held everything she had been able to carry: a stuffed rabbit named Professor Buttons, 3 books from the library that were now overdue, a photograph of her mother, Nia, who had died when Amara was 2. Elias reclined the passenger seat as far as it would go and laid out the blankets he had grabbed from the apartment. He tucked them around Amara carefully, smoothing her soft brown curls back from her forehead. She looked up at him with eyes that were too old for her face. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" Elias forced himself to smile. "We're going to be fine, sweetheart. This is just temporary, like camping." Amara nodded slowly, though they both knew she didn't believe him. She fell asleep eventually, her small hand curled around the ear of Professor Buttons. Elias stayed awake, watching the rain streak down the windshield, listening to the occasional rumble of a truck passing on the highway. He thought about his wife, Nia, what she would say if she could see them now, how ashamed he felt that he couldn't give their daughter anything better than the back seat of a 12-year-old Honda. The next morning, Elias drove back toward the Nexus complex to use the public restroom at the gas station across the street. It was the only place nearby with running water and a door that locked. He parked in the far corner of the lot where the shadows from the building kept the car hidden from casual view. Amara was still asleep in the back. He watched her for a moment, her face peaceful in the gray morning light, and felt something tighten in his chest. She deserved so much more than this. She deserved a room of her own, a bed with clean sheets, a father who could provide for her. He was about to step out of the car when he saw the black SUV pull into the Nexus parking lot across the street, the same SUV from yesterday. It stopped near the main entrance, and Vivian Hart emerged. She was wearing a tailored gray coat and carrying a leather briefcase. She walked with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. But then she paused, her gaze sweeping across the street, landing on the old Honda parked in the shadow of the gas station. Elias froze. For a long moment, Vivian simply stared. Her expression was unreadable from this distance, but something about her posture changed. The set of her shoulders, the angle of her head. She wasn't just looking at them, she was seeing them. A black father and daughter displaced. Then her assistant appeared at her elbow, gesturing toward the building, and Vivian turned away. But as she walked through the glass doors of Nexus Industries, she glanced back one more time. Her face was troubled. 3 days later, Vivian sat alone in her corner office on the 32nd floor, surrounded by reports she didn't want to read. The restructuring had been her decision. Well, not entirely her decision. The board had pressured her for months to cut costs, to trim the workforce, to make Nexus lean and efficient. She had reviewed the termination lists herself, trusting that her management team had made fair, data-driven choices. Now, she wasn't so sure. She pulled up the file on Elias Jones, facilities coordinator, 8 years of service. His performance metrics were solid. His supervisor evaluations were consistently positive. There was nothing in his record that justified termination, let alone the immediate kind that stripped him of severance and benefits. Vivian scrolled through the documentation, looking for the reason he had been flagged for removal. She found it in an appendix labeled Low Performance Indicators. The numbers claimed that Elias had missed dozens of shifts, that his work quality had declined significantly, that multiple complaints had been filed against him. None of it matched what she saw in his actual personnel file. The discrepancy was glaring. Either someone had made a serious clerical error or someone had deliberately falsified the data. Vivian pulled up the internal security footage from the week before the layoffs. She fast-forwarded through hours of mundane office activity until she found what she was looking for. A meeting in Conference Room B of her senior managers, Richard Polk and Gregory Sims. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see Richard handing Gregory a manila folder. Gregory opened it, scanned the contents, and nodded. Then he walked directly to his computer and began typing. Vivian cross-referenced the timestamp with the system logs. Gregory had accessed Elias Jones's personnel file at that exact moment. He had changed the performance metrics. He had added false complaints. He had turned a loyal, competent employee into someone who looked expendable. Vivian leaned back in her chair, her stomach turning. She thought about the black man and the little girl she had seen in the rain, the cardboard box, the eviction notice. She thought about how casually she had signed the termination papers, trusting that her team had done their due diligence. Her signature was on those documents, her name, her authority. Whatever had happened to Elias Jones, she was responsible. She had put him and his daughter on the street. The question now was why Richard and Gregory had wanted him gone so badly and what they were trying to hide. The investigation took Vivian down a rabbit hole she hadn't expected. Budget discrepancies, phantom invoices for services never rendered, shell companies that trace back to offshore accounts controlled by Richard Polk's brother-in-law. Elias Jones's crime, it turned out, was noticing too much. His job in facilities gave him access to the loading docks, the supply rooms, the areas where equipment and materials passed through without much oversight. He had filed 3 separate reports about suspicious deliveries, shipments that didn't match the purchase orders, boxes that arrived empty but were logged as full. Each time his concerns had been dismissed, and now she understood why Elias hadn't been fired for poor performance. He had been fired because he was a threat to the people who were stealing from the company. Vivian sat with that knowledge for a long time. She could have buried it. She could have let Elias Jones remain a casualty of restructuring and focused on cleaning up the corruption quietly without admitting that the layoffs had been compromised. It would have been easier, safer. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that little girl's face pressed against the car window, and she heard her own voice, cool and professional, approving a list of names without question. The first thing Vivian did was find them, not through official channels. She didn't want anyone at Nexus to know what she was doing, not yet. She hired a private service, discreet and professional, to locate Elias Jones and his daughter. The report came back within 24 hours. They were still in the city, moving from parking lot to parking lot, staying one step ahead of security guards and police patrols. Elias had found work at the harbor, loading cargo for cash. 12-hour shifts that paid barely enough to keep gas in the car and food in their stomachs. Amara spent most of her days in the public library, where the heating was free, and the librarians let her stay as long as she was quiet. Vivian drove to the harbor on a Tuesday morning. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the distance, her heels clicking on the wet concrete. She found Elias stacking crates in a warehouse that smelled like fish and diesel. He looked different than she remembered, thinner. There were dark circles under his eyes and a new weariness in the way he held himself. She watched him for a few minutes before he noticed her. When he finally looked up, his expression went from confusion to recognition to something cold and closed. He set down the crate he was carrying and walked toward her slowly. His deep brown hands tightened into fists as he approached. "You're the CEO," he said. It wasn't a question. Vivian nodded. "My name is Vivian Hart. I need to speak with you, Mr. Jones." Elias's jaw tightened. "About what? Coming to make sure I'm not causing problems? Don't worry, I'm not going to sue. I couldn't afford a lawyer, even if I wanted one." Vivian shook her head. "That's not why I'm here." She hesitated, searching for the right words. 8 years of boardroom negotiations hadn't prepared her for this conversation. "I'm here because I made a mistake, and I'm trying to understand what happened." Elias laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What happened is your company threw me out like garbage. What happened is my daughter sleeps in a car now. You want to understand that?" His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned away, running a hand over his face. Vivian stood very still. She could have defended herself. She could have explained about the falsified records, the corruption, the board pressure, but none of that would matter to him. None of that would give him back the weeks he had lost, the dignity that had been stripped from him. So she simply said, "I'm sorry. Elias turned back to her, his eyes wet. "Sorry doesn't put a roof over my daughter's head." That evening, Vivian found them at the community center on Maple Street. It was one of the few places in the city that offered free showers and a hot meal. No questions asked. She spotted Elias sitting at a plastic table near the back, watching Amara eat a bowl of soup. The little girl was talking animatedly about a book she had read at the library. Something about a princess who learned to sword fight. Elias was nodding along, a small smile on his face despite everything. He noticed Vivian approaching, and the smile faded. He stood up, positioning himself between her and Amara. "I thought I made myself clear this morning." Vivian held up her hands. "I'm not here to argue. I brought something." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were printouts of the falsified records, the security footage, timestamps, the internal memos that proved Elias had been targeted. She set the folder on the table and slid it toward him. "I found out why you were really fired," she said quietly. "It wasn't about performance or restructuring. You were asking questions about deliveries that didn't add up. Someone didn't like that." Elias stared at the folder, but didn't touch it. "What are you talking about?" Vivian explained everything. The phantom invoices, the shell companies, Richard Polk and Gregory Sims, and the money they had been siphoning from Nexus for at least 2 years. Elias's reports had gotten too close to the truth, so they had manufactured a reason to remove him, and Vivian, trusting her team, had signed off on it without a second glance. Elias was silent for a long time. Amara had stopped eating, watching the two adults with wide, uncertain eyes. Finally, Elias picked up the folder. He flipped through the pages slowly, his dark brown hands trembling slightly. When he reached the falsified performance report with his name on it, he stopped. "This says I missed 40 shifts last year," he said. "I didn't miss a single day. I was there every morning at 6:30. Every single morning. His voice broke. They just made it up. All of it. They made me look like someone I'm not. Vivian nodded. I know, and I'm going to fix it. Elias looked up at her, his expression raw. How? How do you fix this? My savings are gone. My credit is destroyed. My daughter doesn't have a home. How do you fix any of that? Vivian met his eyes steadily. I don't know yet, but I'm going to try. I'm going to take this to the board, expose what Polk and Sims did, and clear your name publicly. And whatever happens next, you're not going to face it alone. She glanced at Amara, who was clutching her spoon like a lifeline. Neither of you. Elias shook his head slowly. Why? Why do you care? I'm nobody to you. I'm just a name on a spreadsheet. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all evening. Because I'm the one who signed that spreadsheet. Because your daughter asked me something today that I can't stop thinking about. Elias frowned. What did she ask you? Vivian's throat tightened. She asked if I was the reason her father cried at night. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Vivian spent the 4 days leading up to it building her case, gathering evidence, preparing for a fight she knew would be ugly. Richard Polk had allies on the board. Gregory Sims had been with the company for 15 years and knew where all the bodies were buried. They would not go down quietly, but Vivian had something they didn't expect. She had the truth documented and undeniable, and she had Elias Jones, whose face she saw every time she considered backing down. On Thursday evening, the story leaked. Someone, probably one of Polk's people, had tipped off a local business reporter. The headline was carefully worded to sound neutral, but painted a damning picture. Nexus CEO allegedly uses company resources to assist former employee. The subtext was clear. Vivian Hart was either corrupt or incompetent, possibly both. By Friday morning, reporters were gathered outside the Nexus building. Social media was ablaze with speculation. One prominent business commentator had already called for Vivian's resignation, citing concerns about judgment and leadership. None of it mentioned Elias Jones's daughter. None of it mentioned the falsified records or the embezzlement. None of it mentioned the truth. The boardroom was tense when Vivian entered. 12 faces stared at her from around the polished table, some sympathetic, most carefully neutral. Richard Polk sat at the far end, looking smug. Gregory Sims was beside him, fidgeting with a pen. Vivian took her seat at the head of the table and opened her laptop. Before we begin, she said calmly, I want to address the allegations that appeared in the press this morning. Richard leaned forward. I think that would be wise. The shareholders are concerned, Vivian. This kind of scandal isn't good for anyone. Vivian smiled thinly. I couldn't agree more. She clicked a button, and the screen behind her lit up with the first slide of her presentation. It showed a photograph of Elias Jones's personnel file, the real one, alongside the falsified version that had been used to justify his termination. This is Elias Jones, she said. 8 years of loyal service, 0 performance issues, 3 separate reports filed about suspicious activity in our supply chain, and this is what someone did to his file. She clicked again. Security footage of Richard and Gregory in conference room B, then the system logs showing the unauthorized changes to Elias's record, then the bank statements tracing the phantom invoices to offshore accounts. The room was utterly silent. Richard stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. This is ridiculous. These documents are fabricated. She's trying to cover her own incompetence by throwing us under the bus. Vivian turned to face him directly. Mr. Polk, I have time-stamped video of you handing falsified documents to Mr. Sims. I have digital forensics confirming that those documents were uploaded from Mr. Sims's computer, and I have bank records showing $3.2 million transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands that lists your brother-in-law as the primary signatory. She paused. Would you like me to continue? Richard's face had gone pale. He looked around the table for support, but no one would meet his eyes. Gregory Sims was staring at the table, his pen forgotten on the floor. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Helen Park, cleared her throat. "I think we've heard enough, Miss Hart. What do you recommend as next steps?" Vivian stood straight, her voice clear. "I recommend immediate termination for Richard Polk and Gregory Sims, pending a full internal audit and cooperation with law enforcement. I also recommend that Elias Jones be publicly exonerated and offered reinstatement with full back pay and benefits." Helen nodded slowly. "And the press?" Vivian allowed herself a small smile. "I'll handle the press." The vote was unanimous. Outside the boardroom, a crowd had gathered. Not just reporters now, but employees, shareholders, curious onlookers who had seen the news and wanted to know what was happening. Vivian walked to the podium that had been set up for the post-meeting press conference. She looked out at the sea of faces, the camera flashes, the microphones thrust toward her. Somewhere in the back, she could see a familiar figure, Elias Jones, standing alone, watching. "Good afternoon," Vivian began. "I'm here to address the allegations that appeared in the press this morning and to share some important updates about our company." She took a breath. "Over the past week, an internal investigation revealed significant fraud within Nexus Industries. 2 senior managers, Richard Polk and Gregory Sims, systematically embezzled company funds and falsified employee records to cover their crimes. One of the people they targeted was Elias Jones, a facilities coordinator who had been with us for 8 years. Mr. Jones was wrongfully terminated. His records were falsified. He and his daughter were left homeless as a result." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vivian continued, her voice steady. "I signed the paperwork that authorized Mr. Jones's termination. I trusted my team to provide accurate information, and they betrayed that trust. But ultimately, the responsibility is mine. I failed Mr. Jones, I failed his daughter, and today I am doing everything in my power to make it right." Someone shouted from the crowd, a man in an expensive suit, one of the business commentators who had called for her resignation that morning. "What about the allegations that you've been using company resources for personal relationships? Sources say you've been seen with this former employee multiple times." Vivian didn't flinch. "I've been meeting with Mr. Jones because I owed him an explanation and an apology. I've been meeting with him because his 7-year-old daughter has been sleeping in a car while the men who destroyed his career continued to steal from this company." Vivian paused, acknowledging the unspoken weight of the situation for a black single dad. "If showing basic human decency to a wronged employee disqualifies me from leadership, then perhaps we need to reconsider what leadership means." The commentator opened his mouth to respond, but another voice cut through the noise. It came from the back of the crowd where Elias was standing. "She's telling the truth." Every head turned. Elias walked forward slowly, Amara holding his hand. The little girl looked terrified of all the cameras, but she didn't let go of her father. "I didn't want to believe her at first," Elias said. "I thought she was just trying to protect herself, cover her tracks, but she showed me everything. The fake documents, the stolen money. She didn't have to do that. She could have just let me disappear and no one would have cared." He looked at Vivian. "But she cared. She's the only one who did." The reporters scattered to file their stories. Richard Polk was escorted from the building by security, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Gregory Sims had already called a lawyer. The crisis wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be lawsuits and investigations and months of cleanup, but the worst was past. Vivian found Elias and Amara waiting in the lobby. The little girl was holding a juice box that someone had given her, sipping from it solemnly. "Thank you," Elias said quietly, "for what you said in there. You didn't have to defend me like that." Vivian shook her head. "I was telling the truth, that's all." She hesitated. "I meant what I said about reinstatement. There's a position in our security division that I think would suit your skills. It's not facilities, but the pay is better and the hours are more flexible for someone with a child." Elias blinked. "You're offering me a job." Vivian almost smiled. "I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is up to you." Before Elias could respond, Amara tugged on Vivian's sleeve. The CEO looked down at the little girl, surprised. "Yes?" Amara's voice was very small. "Are you going to help us find a house?" The apartment was on the fourth floor of a brownstone in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of the city. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen with a window that faced the morning sun, and a living room just big enough for a couch and a bookshelf. Vivian had owned the building for years, part of a real estate portfolio she had inherited from her grandmother. Most of the units were rented to young professionals at market rate. This one had been vacant for months. She gave Elias the keys on a gray Saturday morning. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking, a black single father overwhelmed by the gift of stability. Amara ran past him into the apartment, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. She found the smaller bedroom and stopped in the doorway, staring at the twin bed with its clean white sheets. "Daddy," she called out, her voice thick. "There's a bed. There's a real bed." Elias closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Vivian stood in the hallway watching. She didn't come inside. This was their space, their moment. She had no right to intrude on it. "The rent is covered for 6 months," she said quietly. "After that, we can work something out. And before you say anything, this isn't charity. Consider it back pay for the weeks you should have been working." Elias shook his head slowly. "I don't know how to thank you." Vivian handed him the keys. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Jones. I'm just trying to fix what I broke." She was about to leave when Amara came running back out of the bedroom. The little girl threw her arms around Vivian's legs, hugging her so hard that Vivian nearly stumbled. "Thank you," Amara whispered. "Thank you for giving us a home." Vivian stood very still. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being touched by children, to being thanked with such simple, devastating sincerity. After a moment, she knelt down so she was at Amara's level. "You're welcome," she said softly. "But you should know something. The people at the company, the ones who said mean things about your dad, they were wrong. They were wrong about everything. Your father is a good man, one of the best I've ever met." Amara nodded solemnly. "I know. He's the best daddy in the world." Vivian smiled, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, the smile reached her eyes. "Yes," she said. "He is." She stood up and looked at Elias, who was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'll let you get settled," she said. "If you need anything, my number is on the paperwork." She turned to leave, but Elias's voice stopped her. "Miss Hart." She looked back. "Yes?" He was quiet for a moment, searching for words. Finally, he just said, "Thank you for believing me when no one else did." The months that followed were not easy, but they were better. Elias started his new job in the security division, and despite his initial reservations, he found that he was good at it. The work was different from facilities, more analytical, more focused on prevention than repair, but he liked the challenge. He liked having a purpose again. Amara started second grade at a school just 3 blocks from their apartment. She made friends quickly. A girl named Maya who shared her love of fantasy novels, and a boy named Sam who taught her how to play chess. On weekends, Elias took her to the park or the library, or the little bakery on the corner that made croissants almost as good as the ones they used to get in their old neighborhood. Vivian visited sometimes, not often, and never without calling first. She would bring pastries from the French place near her office, or books she thought Amara might like, or just herself. Sitting on the couch while Amara showed her drawings and Elias made coffee in the kitchen. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to. The past was there always, a shadow that connected them. But it wasn't the only thing anymore. One evening in late spring, Elias found Vivian sitting on the fire escape outside his living room window. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had brought a bottle of wine, but hadn't opened it. "Mind if I join you?" Elias asked, climbing through the window. Vivian shook her head. He sat down beside her, their shoulders almost touching. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just watched the light change over the rooftops, listened to the distant sounds of traffic and children playing. Finally, Vivian said, "I've been thinking about what comes next." Elias looked at her. "For the company." She shook her head slowly. "For us?" The word hung in the air between them. Us. Such a small word for such a complicated thing. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been thinking about that too. Vivian turned to face him. In the fading light, her eyes were the color of honey, and Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and he held them gently, warming them between his palms. I think, he said slowly, that we've both been through a lot. I think we're both still figuring out who we are and what we want, and I think rushing into anything would be a mistake. Vivian nodded, a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, crossing her face. But Elias wasn't finished. But I also think, he continued, that you're the most remarkable person I've ever met. You had every reason to protect yourself, to let me stay lost, and you didn't. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. You gave my daughter a home. He squeezed her hand gently. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I want you in it, if that's something you want too. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've never been good at this, she said. Relationships, vulnerability, letting people in. My whole life I've kept everyone at arm's length because it was safer. Because people always leave or disappoint you or turn out to be something other than what they seemed. She looked down at their joined hands. But you're different. You and Amara, you're real in a way that nothing else in my life has ever been, and it terrifies me. Elias lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It terrifies me too, he admitted. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared means it matters. Vivian laughed softly, a sound he had rarely heard from her. When did you become so wise? Elias smiled. Probably somewhere between sleeping in my car and having a 7-year-old therapist. The door to the fire escape opened and Amara poked her head out. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with the little rockets on them, and her natural hair was still damp from her bath. Daddy, Miss Vivian, what are you doing out here? Elias held out his free arm, and Amara climbed into his lap, snuggling against his chest. Vivian watched them with an expression of such tenderness that it made Elias's heart ache. We're watching the sunset, sweetheart, he said. Want to join us? Amara nodded sleepily. She looked at Vivian, then at their joined hands, and a small smile crossed her face. Are you and Miss Vivian going to be friends forever? Elias glanced at Vivian. She met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but an understanding, a possibility. Yeah, baby, Elias said softly. I think we might be. Amara yawned and nestled closer. Good, she murmured. I like Miss Vivian. She's not cold like everyone says. She's warm like us. Vivian reached out and gently stroked Amara's hair. Her hand was trembling slightly. Thank you, Amara, she whispered. That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. They sat there together as the sun slipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. 3 people brought together by circumstance and injustice and the stubborn refusal to give up. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. They didn't know if the fragile thing growing between them would survive the challenges ahead. But in that moment on that fire escape, watching the sky turn from gold to violet to the deep blue of evening, none of that mattered. They had found each other. And for now, that was